The Dogwood Church of the Resurrection didn't always go by that name, but it was always a house of God in one way or another. My father was a long-standing member, was involved in most of its services, but from the moment I could walk, he had me helping out too. Most of this story takes place when I was 6 or 7. At that point, I was still too young to be in the choir, but old enough to be trusted with wandering around the building while my dad was off in meetings or otherwise assisting. We were part of a fairly small congregation, but the sanctuary was roomy enough to hold 40 or 50 members in its pews at a time. The windows above us were clear, not stained glass, but there were tapestries on the walls with Jesus giving his Sermon on the Mount, Noah facing God's rainbow, other depictions like that. Then there was the second building, which had classrooms for teenagers, a junior church room, nurseries, a kitchen. Most of those rooms were as bland as communion wafers, not much to write home about. Between the two buildings was a passage, one that dipped below ground, not quite to basement level, but low enough that a chill set in and stayed. The walls of the passage had 6 doors, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. From the chapel, on your way to the second building, all the doors to the right went to empty rooms, the kind that were separated by folding barriers. Nobody ever used them, far as I know. All the doors on the left wall went to, well, I guess I don't know what all was back there, but one of them went to a boiler. The boiler didn't help with warming up the lower area much, but it provided noise in spades. A tinny hiss of gas mixed with burbling fluid. I wasn't allowed in the rooms on the left. It was a stay out or you'll be sorry kind of thing. One year, my father, several other adults, and I were doing some spring cleaning down there and found a compartment in a dark corner of a broom closet. They opened it up and pulled out a glass harmonica. Not that anyone present at that moment knew what it was. Certainly not me in my Sesame Street sweater. The thing was caked in layers of dust, but the adults, curiosity burning, fetched a wet rag. A quick polishing revealed an impressively rendered mahogany frame, a silver foot pedal, and glittering crystal bowls. It had survived through the years in the basement, unmarred by time, without so much as a scratch or crack. I remember looking at the bowls and thinking how much they looked like segments of a worm, suspended sideways as they were. It was only a few moments before someone tried the pedal, and it squeaked to life. After seeing the bowls turn, somebody remarked at the possibility of it being some kind of musical instrument, or at least part of one. The harmonica, everyone learned over the next couple of weeks, was an instrument that was both particularly expensive and hard to play. The initial consensus was to sell it off, but my father led the charge to find someone to play it. Our piano player had moved away the year before, and there was, after all, the distinct possibility that finding it in such good shape was providence. His argument won people over, and a hopeless job ad was placed in the local newspaper announcing that if any glass harmonica players happened to be in the area, they should call our number. Not long after, we had an harmonica player walking through our doors. He was lanky, with a bald spot and sunken eyes. He didn't say much to anyone unless spoken to first. Members of the staff expressed their gratitude at him accepting the job so soon, and for free at that, to which he responded with simple, humble bows. When I heard him play for the first time, I was seated in a pew next to Neil Burbank. Neil was a weird kid. He was big into building models of cars and not much else. For the most part, he kept quiet and to himself, but any attempt at conversation with him would usually be steered into cars and models of them. He was my age, and he was a regular at church, but I couldn't honestly tell anyone that he was my friend. The harmonica player had spindly fingers that could stretch out over and play many bowls at a time. The sound was like perfect ringing wine glasses. We were all enraptured. He was so practiced that one could only notice him occasionally dipping his fingers into his bowl of water to keep the bowls wet if one watched him while he did it. The abstract swirling reliefs on the sides of the machine glistened in the Sunday morning light. The harmonica didn't shift as he played, not as his fingers danced on the bowls, and not when his pedaling increased on the higher notes. It was as steady as God's love. That same Sunday, after service, I went through the basement to get some paper and markers in the other building. I hadn't gotten more than 3 steps down when I started to feel uncomfortable. Before, the basement hadn't been the most pleasant place to hang around, between the noise and the chill. But now, it was different. Sinister, even. Whenever I went through that hallway from then on, I felt like I was being watched, like something was sniffing me out. It was enough to make me hurry through at a little faster than walking pace on most days. I stopped going down there altogether after what happened to Neil. I was deftly piloting a spaceship before service on another Sunday morning, weaving the bread loaf-sized vessel between pews, going full throttle down the aisle, and when I thought no one was looking, landing and taking off from the pulpit. As the clock drew nearer to 9 and the early birds began to flutter in, I decided to voyage to the other building. I don't know why Neil was in that hallway. Maybe he was trying to find the bathroom, or maybe he was as bored as I was. In any case, I opened the hallway door to see him standing at the bottom of the steps, with his back stiffly to the wall, like he was against a cliff face. He was staring upwards, looked almost cross-eyed, as though something was towering over him. He did nothing else except make quick, heavy breaths. He didn't turn or in any way acknowledge me standing dry-mouthed, my toy hanging loosely at my side. I considered doing many things. I could have asked him if he was okay, or if he was lost. I could have walked past him and left him to it. I could have just cleared my throat to announce that I was there. The unease I felt in my stomach made the final call. I shut the door where I stood, doing my best to make as little noise as possible. I stowed my spaceship in my backpack, reaffixed my clip-on tie, and sat down in a pew until service started. I didn't look around to see if or when someone else found him. I slouched with my eyes in my lap until I heard the unearthly ringing of the harmonica. Neil was hit by an 18-wheeler while playing on a playground the following week. The driver, in the middle of a heart attack, careened downhill off the side of the highway, through a barrier, and into Neil's sleepy suburbs. His mother was too far away to move him to safety, but close enough to watch it happen. We prayed for her well-being and thanked God for the time that Neil was on this earth. My parents brought me to the funeral. I think that everyone was under the impression that he and I knew each other better than we did. The harmonica rang its siren's voice throughout, and the player glanced up from his instrument, once only through the whole funeral, and locked his gaunt eyes with mine. As we all left, I watched him get in his car and noticed that he had it loaded up with stacks of canned goods. The more I gleaned from him, the more questions I had. Neil wasn't the last death that year, but I can't remember the names of the others. There was an older man from our congregation who died doing construction work, a woman who occasionally baked oatmeal raisin cookies for us who had a stroke, and a teen who drowned in a pool. With each death, the church became more and more dour. Neil's mother moved to another state, saying she had to get away to stop thinking about it. She wasn't the only one who stopped coming to church. It got to be that sometimes it was just my father and I helping out after hours. Months after Neil died, I was helping to set up the Christmas tree in the lobby when my father asked me to grab a box of lights from the basement. I shook my head no, but I couldn't bring myself to say why I was scared to go down there. This led to a long talk from my dad. He told me that church was one of the safest places you could be and that I needed to trust in God, and that was that. I flamingo walked down the steps and tried not to think about Neil. The buzzing from the lights and the faraway hiss of the boiler were deafening in the quiet of the basement. After reaching the bottom of the steps, I walked confidently, hoping to fool myself. Having blocked out my fear as best I could, I grabbed the box from its room and headed back. Walking the way back, I noticed that the boiler room door was ajar. I'm not sure what to say for myself other than in that moment I was overwhelmed with the desire to know what was beyond that door. To know if what I was feeling in that basement could be justified in any way. I pushed open the boiler room door with the box in my hands. The lights in the room were off, so the musty smells of the boiler room hit me long before I got a visual. There were, of course, the smells of mildew and old wood, but there also was a faint, sweet smell. An array of cloth-covered pipes slowly appeared as my eyes adjusted, followed by the ceiling joist above and the cement floor below. The boiler stood in the corner, like a surly schoolmarm, overseeing her work with disdain. Finally, there was something at the far end, large, shapeless, and unmoving. My sneakers crunched the grit of the cement one step at a time, spaced seconds apart. Drawing closer, I recognized that what I was looking at wasn't a single shape, but a pile. I stooped over, put down the box, and picked up an empty jug of grape juice. It was the kind I knew we served at communion, though the fact that an empty one wound up in the basement was still odd. There were several like it in the pile, along with empty cans of fruit. A few flies tended to the cans and jugs, getting what they could from them. I felt better somehow. I had seen the last areas of the basement and proved to myself that there was nothing down there to be scared of. I picked the box up to leave and froze. I felt a sensation like spiders running down my back as I looked up, and in the dull, buzzing hallway light pouring from the doorway, I saw nothing. There was nothing looming over me, staring into me. It didn't huff great hissing breaths onto my face. It didn't look at me as though wondering whether or not to tear me apart for trespassing. It didn't shift slightly on massive, two-jointed animal legs. I stood paralyzed and started to cry in panicked silence over nothing. My dad called me from upstairs, and a can moved on its own before my eyes as though kicked aside. I took the opportunity to run, flying through the door, up the stairs, and panting into the lobby where my father was waiting for me. He took the box of lights from my arms, and I realized that I'd forgotten I was carrying it. I looked back down the steps, and there was nothing, jealously waiting for me at the bottom. Well, if anyone else discovered the cans like I did, they didn't say anything about it. However, after that incident, the harmonica player, as his fingers squeaked out his melodies, started glancing up at me, like he had at Neil's funeral. Nausea floated through me like a spirit at every service. I murmured the hymns, was barely aware if I was standing or sitting. The voices around me became fewer and fewer in number, creating empty spots in the pews, like naked, diseased patches on a dying animal. The voices left behind lost their tune and rhythm. Service would end, and I wouldn't realize it until there were people shuffling past me in my seat. Nobody spoke as they left to discuss their brunch plans or the service or each other's hair. The harmonica rattled the windows and smothered our thoughts with its tones. It tyrannized the room and bullied us into silence. The truth came to me over weeks, first as an intrusive thought, then as something I obsessed over. What my father thought or what everyone else around me was doing didn't matter to me. What had to be done was obvious. And if I was the only one that could see it, then I was the only one who could do anything about it. The church was within walking distance of my house, and my father had the key to the front door. Past midnight, I slipped out of bed and put 2 pairs of socks on, hoping they would muffle my footsteps. It worked to a point, but the house itself creaked under my weight to betray me. Still, I made it downstairs without waking my parents. I put on my backpack, snatched my dad's keys from the counter, and left the house in my pajamas. Walking outside in the cold night made me aware of how alone I was. I felt fear welling in my chest, not for my safety, but for what would happen if I was found out by my parents. I was worried that I was sinning, misbehaving because I wanted to. Once, I tried to run away from home because my mother told me I couldn't watch a TV show. On that day, I didn't get further than the end of the block before I started worrying about how I'd live away from my parents. This time, however, I was more concerned about what would happen if I didn't follow through, if I went back to my bed and fell asleep. Despite my anxious thoughts, I was at the church sooner than I expected. I glanced around me before going in, but there wasn't really even a question. I was alone. The latch opened with my father's key, making a loud clack inside the giant door. The harmonica glimmered as I moved from the door to the pulpit. Never before or since have I hated anything so much, especially something incapable of glaring back at me. I gave the harmonica a look over. Just about anything would do it. Slipping my backpack from my shoulder to the floor was as loud as an avalanche compared to the otherwise silent church. I unzipped my bag, took out my spaceship, and held it by the neck of its hammer-like body. Before my muscles had even tensed to begin, cold doubt rinsed away my righteous self-assurance. My surroundings reasserted themselves in my mind. A beam tapped out a low creak in the rafters. A couple windows rattled as a gust of wind struck them. My arms acted independently from my mind. I struck the toy against the largest bowl, hard. It cracked immediately. I let out a long breath and could feel burning emotion on it as it passed over my tongue. Somewhere near the basement, I could swear I heard a thump. But that was all that happened. I did it again, and the bowl shattered completely to the board below it, leaving only a jagged ring of glass suspended on the rod. I did the same with the next bowl, and I heard another thump. This time, I realized it was coming from the basement door itself. Fear filled my core and catalyzed me. I brought the toy down again on the next bowl, and so on, down the line, going faster as I became frantic. With each bowl that broke, the pounding on the door became louder and more persistent. The basement door burst open, right as I was poised to destroy the last bowl. From the corner of my eye, I saw a dark form step out. No longer invisible, but misshapen and raw. It collapsed like a newborn giraffe as the spaceship came down. I jerked my head up, but all I could see was an empty church. No one could agree on who had done it or why. The police were called, but they didn't find anything useful and gave up within hours. If I wasn't feeling guilty before, at this point I definitely was. My father was particularly upset, but he didn't yell or pace. He just sat in a pew with his head bowed in prayer. Nobody was sure how they were going to break the news to the harmonica player either, only they didn't have to. That day, he didn't show up. He didn't show up the next week either. In fact, nobody from the church ever saw him again.